Hi everybody. Welcome to our lecture series on the divine principle. I'm going to be your lecturer for the next few lectures. My name is Reverend Kevin McCarthy, and I'm glad that you've made the decision to take a look at the divine principle. Before we go into our first presentation on the principle of creation, I'd like to give a little bit of an introduction of some things to consider as you take the next few days to study the content of the divine principle. You know, if we think about it, we are people like this gentleman here, and all of us are seeking happiness. We want to be happy. I don't think anybody today woke up with the idea that they were going to be unhappy and seek unhappiness. But as much as we all seek happiness and try to avoid misfortune, sometimes it's pretty difficult to achieve that goal. We all want to be happy, but golly, it's really hard to achieve that sometimes. And one reason that we have such a challenge to achieve a lasting happiness in our life is because it almost seems that we're at odds with ourselves. Although we all have an original mind, an original nature which seeks happiness and seeks God. And Paul talked about it in the 7th chapter of Romans, that within our innermost self we seek to do the law of God, to serve God and to find God, and to really live a life of unselfishness and to do good things. But unfortunately, we experience another side to us, what we could call our evil mind. And this is what also Paul indicated in the 7th chapter of Romans, that yet there's another part of us which is in the members of my body, which seems to oppose my effort to do good. Paul said, the good that I want to do, this I do not do. The evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Who will rescue me, indeed, from this body of death? So we really have two minds. We're in a state of contradiction. We're like two people. We want to do good, but evil is right there with us. And because of this contradiction within us, we have a tendency to nullify our life, and very easy to end up feeling very blasé and unmotivated and uninspired about life. We see that in the extreme, many people totally give up on life itself and even commit suicide. We see in our world today that the suicide rate is increasing at a very alarming rate. It's indicative of the fact that we're not really clear on what is the purpose of our life and why we are living. We could say that the human fall is at the root of our fall into ignorance and struggle. And you could say that we're coming out of a total nebulous fog, where we don't know the meaning of life or the purpose of life or where we're going, or if life is eternal and why am I living, and if there is a spiritual world, what's it like, and what am I doing here in this temporal life in the flesh. There's such an array of ignorance. Actually, when we think about that, there's really two major aspects to our ignorance corresponding to our mind and our body. You know, we have we could say an internal mind, our internal intellect. And our internal intellect, which is more deep, it really deals with issues of more spiritual and philosophical things, whereas our external intellect is more focused on reason and ration and what is the nature of matter and experimentation and science and so forth. And as a matter of fact, Our internal intellect is the part of ourself, the more internal or spiritual part that seeks to resolve this issue of internal ignorance. We are ignorant, and that ignorance manifests internally and externally. So our internal ignorance would be questions like, who are we? Is there a God? What is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of life? I remember when I was young, I told my father that I needed to find myself. I didn't know who I was, and he told me to reach in my pocket and pull out my driver's license because my name was right on there, my name and address, my picture. He said, that's who you are. Now go get a job. But of course, there's a deeper part to life than just having employment or just getting a degree. And that's really the internal side of our mind. It's seeking to resolve those fundamental questions of life. And one of those questions for me was, is life eternal? And I remember the experience I had when I first had my first experience with death and saw a dead person. And it had a startling effect on me because I could see, I could sense that that body had lost some kind of essence, some kind of eternal aspect. It had left that body. And so I became deeply curious about what that was and where that went. And that certainly was germane to my own life. So that's the internal side of our ignorance, which is the pursuit of our internal intellect, which is really the religious, spiritual nature of man. Our external intellect pursues external ignorance, the nature of matter. How do things work? What makes fire? How do you heat the house? What is heat? What do you get when you put sodium and chloride together? And how does the universe operate? And do the planets go around the sun, or is the Earth the middle of the solar system? Those kinds of questions also are a pursuit of our intellect, but more our external intellect that wants to understand the nature of matter and the ways of the physical universe to resolve external ignorance. But we have seen that in this effort to resolve ignorance, sometimes some people will emphasize the internal route. Others will go the external route. And out of the internal route comes the discipline of religion. And out of the external route comes the many disciplines of science. So it's the disciplines of science which seek to resolve the external truths and to find them and to resolve external ignorance, I should say. Whereas the disciplines of religion pursues internal truth and seeks to resolve internal ignorance. But we've seen that over history, it seems that religion and science are at odds. They seem to refute one another, or they battle one another. It seems that for some reason, internal truth and external truth don't get along. And very typically, one will distrust the other. Religion has a tendency to see science as the work of the devil, seeking to refute long-standing biblical truths, whereas science will look at religion as the opiate of the people, as nothing more than superstitions and myths, and look down on religion as not empirical, and really disregard it as an important element in life. So that's kind of been the tradition of science and religion, to conflict. But really that is a very unusual and unnatural situation, because in fact truth is very harmonious. Be it internal or external, truth should harmonize. And so we say that in our time, As we've entered the 21st century, there's really a need for a new truth that can lead us to a world of goodness. It's not a coincidence that most of the world's Christians are expecting the return of Christ. We feel certainly the year 2000 is a very, very significant and timely era in the providence of God. So to realize a world of goodness, we need truth. We need a higher and greater truth. Well, it's not non-biblical to expect such a thing, because we see in 1 Peter 1:5, for example, that it says that we are shielded with God's power until the coming of the salvation that is to be revealed in the last days. Well, what is that? That's the new truth that we're talking about. It's a greater truth, a higher truth. Just as Paul said that with our salvation comes a hope for a future glorification, the redemption of our bodies. And so we see that God is coming to complete His providence and to bring about a new age where we will beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks, where the knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. And that's really what new truth does. But new truth, in a practical sense, will be very comprehensive truth, because God created the world of science, and He created the world of religion. I don't mean He created science and religion, but God created the object of interest of science, the physical world, and natural laws and so forth were created by God, as are the internal laws of God. And those laws are not in contradiction, but they're in harmony. So certainly the completed truth, as Paul said, now we see but through a glass darkly, but then we will see clearly face to face. With the new truth, we will be able to understand clearly how internal and external truth relate together, how religion and science can harmonize. And you know what? When religion and science harmonize, it's not going to be religious science or scientific religion, but it'll be it'll be truth. Something that will be unique and higher than the sum of the parts. The harmony of external truth and internal truth, and that ultimately that will be the resolution of our internal and external ignorance, which I think Paul is alluding to when he says, now through a glass darkly, but then we will be able to see clearly. And we will have the wherewithal and the tools to actually build God's kingdom. So what is the mission then of that truth? It's to bring unity, that we may be able to unify, and that God will be our God and we will be His people, and there'll be no weeping and wailing. We will be one family, and therefore all the competing religions and ideologies and philosophies will pass by the wayside, and we will have a clear understanding of our commonality as God's sons and daughters. We are one family, and that will be the prevailing spirit of that time, of that era that we are now entering. That new realm, that new dispensation of truth will bring about that environment. And so there'll be no more weeping and wailing, and death will be no more. Revelation promises us, because there'll be no more grounds for conflict. And ultimately, the conflict within the individual. Sometimes, I would say the more secular view is that somehow peace will come to the world and it'll trickle down to me. But really, God's way of bringing peace is to resolve the conflict within. Ultimately, as Jesus told us, that it's out of the heart come all iniquity. Ultimately, our heart has to be cleansed. Our heart has to be made anew in order to resolve this conflict within. And ultimately, all conflict in the world is an extension of this fundamental conflict within us. So In this final age, we will be transformed from fallen people of contradiction and conflict to the original state where we have one parent, one God. We will be His people, and God will be our God. Ultimately, that is the age that we are entering today. And this divine principle message is ultimately concluding in that way, that to understand the meaning of our age, our time, in the light of God's providence. Well, we can see in our age today that we have tremendous problems in our society, rooted around the breakdown of the family. It is America's great moral and social crisis, the family. Well, the family is not a human invention. The family is something that is deeply rooted in God. We see in Genesis 1:27 that God made male and female in His image. Male and female, in His image. So we see this pair system of man and woman, husband and wife, and the family. Something that is very much germane to the very nature of God. It's an institution that predates the church, existed before there was a Bible. Adam and Eve had no scripture, no ritual. They walked and talked with God, and yet the institution of marriage and family was the bedrock institution in the Garden of Eden. And yet today, at the end of the age, we see that the family is breaking down and is today America's greatest moral and social problem. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson spoke at Howard University, and he said this, and this is very true: the family is the cornerstone of our society. More than any other force, it shapes the attitude, the hopes, the ambitions, the values of the child. And when the family collapses, it is the children that are usually damaged. When it happens on a massive scale, the community itself is crippled. Now, why are we reading something from over 40 years ago? Well, it shows us that even back in the 60s, there was a clear understanding of the role of the family, and that the family, we can see from the 50s and increased certainly in the 60s, was a key decade where the family and the commitment of men and women to one another as husbands and wives really declined and took a turn for the worse. We have been on a 40 or 50 year slide into social chaos, and we really have to take a look at what are some of the pressures and problems that have brought us to such a position of moral and social crisis. Let's look at some of these statistics. I think probably you've heard some of these, but it's good to be aware of it. From 1970 to 2000, we see that the rate of marriage declined by 1/3. Divorce rates have doubled over the course of 30 years, from 1970 to the year 2000. Married couples with children declined by 1/3. Out-of-wedlock births have tripled during this time. And cohabitations, couples living together without marriage, has increased. That's not 100%, that's 3 zeros, folks. 1,000% in this 30-year period. Now, this was statistics from the U.S. Bureau of Census. Now, we have to consider what are the implications of some of these things. Patrick Fagan from the Heritage Foundation said the following: in 1950, for every 100 children born, 12 entered a broken family. Today, for every 100 children born, 60 will enter a broken family. Each year, about 1 million children experience the divorce of their parents. 1.25 million are born out of wedlock, and another 1.4 million are aborted. Child abuse is growing steadily, and child sexual abuse is growing fastest of all. So we're seeing there are social consequences to the breakdown of the family, which in essence means that men and women are losing the ability to make lasting commitments to one another. Look at the results. What are the consequences of the breakdown of the family? We see that that it seriously damages the individual. It causes an undercurrent of a crippling of that individual's ability to go out and to commit and to achieve a successful and stable family. Divorce is the #1 cause of childhood depression, according to the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. And in a 1994 study at Duke University, family breakdown, they found, is the #1 cause of suicide by young men. Dr. Gene Brody, in his book, The Study of Competence of Children and Families, stated that children of divorce are 5 times more likely to be suspended from school, 3 times as likely to need psychological counseling, and twice as likely to repeat a grade, are absent from school more, and late to school more often, and show many more health problems. So we can see that family breakdown has a consequence to young people and does serious damage to young people. And then, of course, it cripples them in their ability to make a stable and lasting family. 75% of all youth in substance abuse programs are children of family breakdown, single-parent homes. 63% of all youth suicides are young people who have experienced the divorce of their parents. 75% of all youth in correctional institutions, if you examine their home life, you will find that 75% have experienced the divorce of their parents or were raised by one adult who never married the other parent. Very, very tragic implications. 70% of all teen pregnancies. You go back and you examine the teens that are becoming pregnant, you will find the same circumstance, that there is a vicious cycle here of family breakdown. Family breakdown begatting more family breakdown. The vicious cycle, 85% of teen fathers abandon their child and its mother. So it extends to the next generation. And it destroys the community. This is a very staggering and sobering statistic. Again, Patrick Fagan of the Heritage Foundation, in his study on the breakdown of the family, found that when the number of single-parent families reaches around 30%, that community begins to break down and the rate of crime begins to soar. The community changes from a supportive environment to one that jeopardizes the development of children. Whenever there is too high a concentration of broken families in any community, that community will disintegrate. So what we're looking at is, the root cause of crime and social problems is the inability for men and women in that community to make lasting commitments to each other. The breakdown of marriage and family is at the root cause of today's social ills and the breakdown of our society. This gentleman, Professor J.D. Unwin, is a British anthropologist from the early 20th century. He was a student of Freud, and he attempted to do a study of 88 civilizations. And in his study, what he found, and it's rather interesting because his initial motive was to more or less prove that religious influence over the sexual relation had created an undue and negative pressure upon society. But what he found was the opposite, that wherever any civilization that emphasized strong family, marital fidelity, and a premarital abstinence was a nation or a civilization that would then be on the rise, would be a vibrant culture of art, science, and creativity, and would have the wherewithal to endure over time. Conversely, any civilization that embraced indiscriminate extramarital sexual relations resulted in men and women unable to commit to one another. Family breakdown became prevalent. Premarital sexual relations becomes the norm. Any civilization that embraced that type of style then declined very rapidly within 3 generations. And there were no exceptions in his study. No exceptions. Every civilization that displayed these characteristics declined within 3 generations, no exceptions. Any civilization that embraced a premarital abstinence and marital fidelity then became cultures and civilizations that were vibrant, productive, and enduring. It's not a coincidence. It's a fundamental principle to life. Dr. Unwin's study, very, very, very instructive for our time today. We have to also look at the situation of the church, because the church is being challenged. We see in a study that was done that 67% of Americans believe that sex is permissible outside of marriage. And as a result of that, fewer and fewer clergy are willing to preach about marital fidelity and premarital abstinence. The idea that kids are going to have sex, the young people are going to have sex, and just to acquiesce to it is the contemporary wisdom. But it is extremely faulty. 56% of single fundamentalists engage in sex outside of marriage. It is becoming more and more common. 66% of single Catholics engage in sex outside of marriage. And it is a growing problem for the clergy as well. As a matter of fact, in 1988, Leadership magazine did a study of 1,000 clergy, and out of 1,000 clergy, over 20% were willing to admit to an adulterous affair while they were ensconced in the pulpit of a church. While they were leading a church community, they engaged in an adulterous affair. That's 20% admitted. That doesn't mean that it was just 20%. I'm sure there was many out of that 1,000 that were unwilling to admit it. This is a serious problem amongst the clergy. Even though Paul told us in 1 Corinthians that we should flee from sexual immorality, that he who sins, all other sins are outside the body, but he who sins sexually sins against his own body. And yet the frequency of sexual sin, sexual immorality, and the breakdown of the family are very much related to the fact that the church is losing its moral authority to guide society away from the problem, out of the problem. A national survey of Christians indicates that born-again Christians have a slightly greater probability of divorce at 27% than the rest of society at 24%. This is a study by George Barna. It's very amazing numbers. So we can see that this is a problem in the church and outside the church, and we need to find a solution. Certainly in the news, we've been hearing a lot. Church scandals, the televangelist scandals and so many sexual problems inside the church. And this really does tremendous damage, because really it is the spiritual leaders of the nation that should exemplify the standard, not just preach about it, but really show an example of commitment between man and woman, husband and wife, and to really show the beauty and benefit of creating family units, and demonstrate that benefit to society, and why a stable society is absolutely dependent upon the stable families within that society. Family relationships are relationships which are grounded in spiritual law. Again, they're not institutions that are created by man, but they're based upon biblical principles, yes, but even more than biblical principles, because they predate the Bible. God created man and woman in His image in the Garden of Eden, even before there was a Bible, a church, a denomination. Adam and Eve walked and talked with God. So this principle of the relationship of a committed man and woman is really a divine design that reflects the very design of God Himself. It's not the invention of a social custom or of human reason. And so it cannot be violated without destructive results. This is really what we are concluding here in this introduction, that society and individuals experience tremendous negative consequences as this fundamental institution falls apart. God wants to restore the family. He wants to empower and restore it. And new truth is coming. You know, we want to live in a world of peace. And that's something that everyone is longing to achieve. But you know, we need principles. And in the principles of creation, we see that the pair system is fundamental. We said earlier that a world of peace will be the result of resolving the issue of conflict within. The next step of resolving that conflict is between men and women, so that men and women can stand together as the image of God and form families. Just as we see the pair system in all things in creation, men and women are to stand in front of God as committed husbands and wives. And the family, God-centered family, becomes the cornerstone of society. And thus, it's the God-centered family that really is the cornerstone for our hopes for peace. Can you read what that says? You can't? Well, here, I'll help you. It says, the hope of all mankind is a unified world of peace. And that was written by Reverend Sun Myung Moon. This is Reverend and Mrs. Moon. And in 1936, Reverend Moon had a very profound spiritual experience with Jesus Christ. And from that time, he was guided to study the Word of God and to prepare himself for a great mission in a great era. Reverend Moon's teaching on the divine principle is the Bible-based teachings which really reaffirm those time-honored truths that underpin the family and lead each individual to an eternally happy and fulfilling life. In this lecture series, we will cover several important topics, from the principle of creation to the fall of man and how we lost the original ideal. And then we will study God's effort through history to restore mankind, and how the Messiah, the Christ, becomes the central figure to that hoped-for change. We will study the history of Israel, the foundation that God made for Christ to come into the world. And we'll study also the mission of Jesus and the foundation that was laid 2,000 years ago. We'll also see how God has worked to prepare the world the last 2,000 years. And finally, we will come to our age in the light of God's providence. And we will find out, as we all felt when the clock ticked and the year 2000 was upon us, we felt that our time is very significant in the providence of God. These are some of the things that you'll be studying over the course of next several days. And I really do hope that you will go through each section of the principle, study it, play it again, and write down your questions. And I hope that you will find it tremendously informative, inspiring, and become a guide for your life, so that you can, as a person, find happiness within yourself, and as a husband or wife can give more to your spouse and form a family of happiness, unity, and joy. Again, our goal is to find happiness. That's what God wants us to find, is to be happy as people, as a nation, and as a world. We all long for a unified world of peace where we stand as one family. And that's what this teaching is about. So I hope that you will find it stimulating, inspiring, and exciting. So God bless you, and good luck as you now begin your study of the divine principle. Thank you very much, and God bless you.